It was November of 1999. People were abuzz about the new year, Y2K. It was not just a new year, but a new millennia. It was also the perfect time of year for cavers and outdoor enthusiasts to head south, where they could enjoy their hobbies in temperate climates without prohibitively cool weather back home. That was the background that brought professional diving instructors Vincent Skaff of Nashville, Tennessee, and Daniel Patterson from Atlanta, Georgia, to one of the world's most famous cave diving spots, 40 Fathom Grotto. However, in spite of their training and their planning, the pair's trip turned into tragedy in the cave known as Florida's bottomless pit. The pair met up in one of the nearby towns close to the grotto, once known as Zuber Sink. Once they were in the area, they prepared for their dive, which was scheduled on a Saturday. Both Daniel and Vincent had been to 40 Fathom before. After all, it was practically the birthplace of technical diving. Using the knowledge and first-hand experiences they gained from this massive flooded sinkhole, they instructed and even saved countless cave divers and regular scuba divers over the years. The scenery of their destination formed a different picture of Florida compared to the stereotypical view of Miami beaches. There, in the northern central part of the state, the land was filled with rolling sandhills that met with pine flatwoods and upland hardwood forests streaked with wetland swamps bustling with gruff toads calling from the surface of the murky water. With water temperatures around 68 degrees and no currents, the men didn't feel the need to over-prepare. They could use thick wetsuits instead of the more cumbersome dry suits. And they didn't need to plan intricate routes since the cave fans out into mostly open waters below the surface. Going near the edges of the cave would put cavers below a rocky ceiling that has nearly constant curvature all the way around. If divers ever got lost, they could theoretically follow the ceiling to safety. However, deeper sections are more complicated, and the sheer size of the cave makes it easy to get turned around if divers lose their way. Back in the 90s, the area looked similar to how it looks today, only a little more rough around the edges. Today, the cave divers would have gone past the gate to find a large dock complete with a partial ceiling, benches, trash cans, gear stations, and ladders, making it the perfect spot for divers. The dock floats like a barge above the waters that glow an iridescent green when lit by lamps at nighttime. The pair had breakfast and suited up, a process that took even longer than normal for this adventure. They were heavily loaded with gear because they were undertaking what's known as technical diving. In recreational scuba, people only wear one tank, and they can opt out from using other fancy equipment. Technical diving takes people to significantly deeper waters, and 40 Fathom Grotto pushes cavers to the limits of even technical diving with its max depth of 240 feet, when the hard limit on technical diving is 300 feet. To accomplish their goal of reaching the bottom of Zuber Sink, they had to bring 2 cylinders of air with proper attachments, and 1 more can of air that they would carry on their side. These canisters could each contain different mixtures of air, so they would have to plan their mixtures before the dive and properly utilize them during the descent. They likely also brought a spare mouthpiece, a reel of guiding line each, something to write on underwater to assist with communication, at least 1 knife or shears, and their fins, masks, and other basics. Other cavers and divers were there on the dock, waiting for their turn, taking part in lessons, or simply chatting with friends as the holidays quickly approached. Once they were fully suited, they stepped off the dock and into the huge pool of water below. They followed hefty guiding lines down to a few training platforms below the water. Soon, the sun above looked small and distorted as they became fully immersed in another world. If they swam in the center of the water, they could hardly tell it was a cave structure. They found a number of strange objects you wouldn't expect to see in the bottom of a natural spring cave. Boats, cars, a 2-seater submarine, and even an airplane fuselage sat rusting beneath the tranquil waters to entertain divers, creating a sense of wonder and exploration that was like any experience the pair had ever encountered in any other spot. However, not all of these attractions were placed here intentionally. Some cars sunk to the bottom after drivers accidentally ran off the road and plunged into the water. Others were disposed of by illicit thieves running chop-chop services, selling stolen car parts and dumping the metal carcasses in the former privacy of the grotto. The pair looked on the wreckage fondly, remembering how they learned the ropes and became inspiring figures in their respected communities. Beyond entertainment or odd circumstance, some of these sunken objects served as instructional tools to teach cave divers techniques for exploring wreckage. They felt in good company, even when they were separated from the parties above. 40 Fathom is an inland spring cave located on private property owned by legendary diver Hal Watts. At nearly 88 years old today, Watts helped shape the world of scuba diving. He even created the Professional Scuba Instructors Association International, or PSAI, back in 1962. 5 years later, Hal, aka Mr. Scuba, set a world record for the deepest air dive at 390 feet, and he later went 415 feet down to get the deep air cave diving world record, descending into the depths using regular air jammed into canisters, a feat that was later broken by his daughter, Scarlett. Skaff and Patterson weren't going to come close to those depths, but even at lesser depths and equipped with better gear, they still face significant challenges ahead. It's easy for cavers to descend hundreds of feet below ground in open-air caves because the air pressure equalizes with the outside through entrances or other cracks. But even going just 60 feet underwater can cause serious changes to the body. At the lowest reaches of 40 Fathom, Skaff and Patterson would be exposed to pressures of roughly 118 pounds per square inch, or around 8 times the atmospheric pressure at sea level. As they swam down, the air in their body compressed under the pressure around them, causing nitrogen to build up in their organs and tissues, a condition known as nitrogen narcosis, which could lead to death. Like all deep dives at the grotto, the divers followed massive guiding lines that marked different depths. As they swam deeper, they had to be more vigilant with each stop, checking for any signs within themselves and their partner, and they would only proceed further down if both agreed they were okay. The effects of deep diving weren't noticeable at first, but as they got deeper, their focus and mental accuracy began to slip away. They prepared for this. They knew it would happen. Some people say nitrogen narcosis is like being drunk or even high on benzodiazepine drugs. It causes mental impairment and tunnel vision. But it wasn't the only problem they had to face. The oxygen in their tanks that they needed to survive could also become poisonous at great depth. Prolonged exposure to a state known as hyperoxia, or oxygen poisoning, can cause damage to the lungs. The retinas in the eyes could detach, which could lead to permanent blindness, and it could even cause seizures, which would mean death at lower depths. Patterson and Skaff were in the right place to test their limits, since Mr. Scuba was one of the top experts at the time, teaching people emergency response techniques for narcosis management. Back then, divers were still experimenting with different blends of gases to see if they could limit or cure nitrogen narcosis. 40 Fathom seemed like the perfect place to test new theories. They had an expert and trained staff waiting on them on the docks above in case anything went wrong. On land, air contains around 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, and a 1% mix of various other gases. Mr. Scuba's training center at the grotto used mostly open air for their dives, which was more susceptible to the effects of nitrogen narcosis. Roughly a decade prior to this dive, cave divers began experimenting with a new blend of gases called trimix, which replaces some of the nitrogen in their air with helium to lower the impact of nitrogen buildup. Trimix has become the standard for most technical diving-related depths, and at depths beyond 328 feet, nitrogen is replaced completely with helium. Now, while these gases make deep diving safer, they can't prevent nitrogen buildup. Since divers were experimenting with other mixtures at the time, it is possible the group used their third tank for a unique mixture. Their experimental method was a necessary step for cave diving, but it would be a fatal mistake. Their battle was not like the cave disasters from open-air adventures. They had no deadly fissures to cross, no dynamic climbs that could slam them against the stone, and almost no worries about rockfall. Instead, their battle would be with their own bodies. If any signs of nitrogen narcosis began to take hold, they had to trust that their training would keep them level-headed enough to overcome a sudden and severe sickness. Even with modern science, researchers still don't fully understand how nitrogen and other gases cause these dangerous effects, which makes every dive a gamble on life. Plus, if they had even a slight cold impacting their sinuses, the depths they chose to descend to could burst their eardrums if they were unable to equalize pressure. Patterson and Skaff made one final check at around 190 feet. They were getting woozy, but that was expected. They could still write and use hand signals, and they weren't losing buoyancy or swimming erratically. Moments later, their nightmare began. Patterson thought they were around nearly 200 feet deep when disaster struck, but later reports indicate that they were around 230 feet deep when he noticed that they had been underwater longer than they had planned. Despite going through all their safety checks, time still slipped away in the fog of pressure and nitrogen that was slowly killing the cells in their bodies. Patterson tried to signal to Skaff. In the dark silence of the cave waters, Patterson had to rely on visual cues to get his diving buddy's attention. Skaff didn't realize his vision had already begun to narrow under the effects of narcosis, and, without acknowledging Patterson, he swam away. Shocked, but still level-headed, Patterson swam faster to catch up with him. As he pushed himself, he breathed harder and faster. His vision tightened on the sight of his friend and fellow instructor. As he coursed forward, he suddenly felt a tug pull him backwards and his movement constricted. He tried to flip around to see what it was, but he couldn't see what was happening. After twisting and turning in the cold depths of the cave, he realized he was wrapped in some rope line. Maybe the rope was already there before, or maybe he lost control of his own reel and it ensnared him near the very bottom of the grotto. Patterson took a moment to center himself and calm down. He began methodically following the line and untangling himself from its grasp. It took some time, and when he was done, Skaff was nowhere to be seen. Patterson realized his time was almost up. His primary air supplies were running out of gas. At this rate, he'd die before he finished the final phase of their planned dive, decompressing. Like shaking a bottle of soda, the compressed air absorbed by Patterson's body would gradually release as he rose to higher elevations. Rising too quickly can be like shaking a bottle of soda. Bubbles can form, causing decompression sickness, DCS, or the bends. Gas bubbles can form in practically any part of the body. If the bends form in the skin, divers usually only experience itching or swelling. But if gas pockets form in the blood, spinal cord, or brain, they could stop breathing, become paralyzed, fall into a seizure, and die. Patterson needed to gradually ascend to allow nitrogen to slowly escape, but he knew he wouldn't have enough time to fully decompress. And to make matters worse, he had no idea where Skaff was. It was getting harder to see, not just because of the narcosis, but because the water of the cave itself was changing. Sometimes the clear water from the spring gets dyed a murky brown, which can hamper sight and make the dive even more dangerous. This rare situation happens when floods carry sediment into the water supply. Normally, divers can see around 50 to 60 feet in the cave. But when this flood of tea-colored water dyes the cave, visibility drops to as little as 3 feet, effectively blinding the cavers. It's unclear what visibility was like back then, but the deepest section of the cave had its own dangers. Starting at around 200 feet, thick layers of muck coated the bottom of the cave where it's the most inconvenient. At those depths, one wrong move could mean your doom. Even in his panic and sick haze, Patterson knew that 40 Fathom Cave wasn't a twisting labyrinth. So, if Skaff realized he was alone, he should be able to follow the walls to safety. The mouth of the cave is about an acre wide, and it stretches out much further below the surface. However, it's mostly uniform like a dome. The deepest section veers off to one side with some ledges that could trip people up, but if he followed the incline, he might already be decompressing on his way to the surface. But little did he know, duckweed infestations were slowly growing in the grotto, covering the surface of the rocks and turning the water green with plant matter. At one point in the grotto's history, the algae covered the rock walls, hiding the stone beneath and making it harder to see the gradient of the ceiling above. Since he knew he was screwed either way, Patterson desperately searched for any sign of Skaff. But there were no bubbles, no signs of movement, no sounds, and no guiding line to follow. After spending a few more moments past his own safety threshold, he had no choice but to ascend and pray he wouldn't pass out or run out of air. While Patterson was in danger and actively swimming toward the surface, Skaff was experiencing a horrible fate. Nitrogen narcosis doesn't just lead to a state of drunkenness, it's far more sinister. It can cause memory loss, which can rob divers of their training. They could forget the condition even existed or how to handle themselves. It can also lead to hallucinations, which could be devastating. Skaff could have been swimming in circles. He could have forgotten he was underwater, or he could have already been knocked out by the surge of toxic gases. The final nail in Skaff's coffin was likely their unique air mixture, which could have contained a high percentage of oxygen. Some divers theorized that the effects of deep diving could be countered with higher oxygen content in their tanks, so divers began testing high oxygen blends. But deep pressure causes any air mixture to get denser, making it harder for divers to breathe. This effect is worse with heavier molecules, and oxygen is approximately 12% heavier than nitrogen and 8 times heavier than helium. Skaff's lungs were filled with oxygen that his body turned into CO2, which is even heavier still. These heavy molecules resisted exhalation under the extreme pressure of the underwater cave. With nowhere to go, the carbon dioxide was forced into his bloodstream, poisoning him and worsening the effects of nitrogen narcosis. Skaff's brain sensed the rising carbon dioxide, which triggered his body to breathe heavier and faster as he was suffocating. And this domino effect also leads to panic. Skaff was in a death spiral, one that Hal Watts, or Mr. Scuba, nearly died from in his own training in that same cave back in 1962. Meanwhile, Patterson surged through the water towards the surface, and witnesses immediately knew there was a problem. He instantly started struggling to get his gear off and orient himself. Seeing him struggle, others came to help him to the water's edge. It was clear he was in pain, and they had to help pull him from the water. They all knew he had the bends, and if he had rocketed to the surface alone, that meant Skaff was in trouble. They were asking questions, trying to understand what happened, trying to figure out what they needed to do for him. Staff and other divers called for an ambulance. Patterson's confusion made it hard for him to express what had happened, but the truth was, he didn't know what happened. Skaff disappeared into the dark waters of the cave. Divers began searching the upper levels of the grotto for Skaff, but even by the time the ambulance arrived, they knew it was a recovery mission. Even as an ambulance rushed him away, Patterson was still fighting for his life. The effects of decompression sickness could send him into his own death spiral at any moment. Divers from the sheriff's office and other local rescue groups suited up and plunged into the waters of 40 Fathom Grotto. They searched the rocky crags for any sign of him. Scrapes on the wall, floating reels of rope, gear, a note, anything. They fanned out from the diving lines to systematically cover the most ground, but they also had to worry about the same dangers that the two instructors faced. They resurfaced and tried again after a break, but there was still no sign of him. Every trip had to be carefully planned. It would take the cave divers over an hour to decompress after spending just 10 minutes at the lowest reaches of the cave. The waiting tested the mental strength of the divers as they floated powerlessly in the water, unable to do more for the poor soul trapped in the cave. They searched for almost 7 hours, but there was nothing to be found. Unlike a regular cave rescue, they couldn't simply call for more support. Only a handful of divers were certified to handle the deepest reaches of 40 fathom. This was also in the 90s, when communication and the internet were still light years behind the modern day. It would have been hard or impossible to get more specialists into the area to expand the search. The next day, Watts and a few other pros donned their own gear to aid in the search. After several more hours, they found Vincent Skaff's body. They had been searching near the bottom, but Skaff was stuck under a small ledge around 154 feet down. If he just swam along the wall instead of straight up, he may have survived. His buoyancy devices were fully inflated. Skaff had tried to send himself rocketing to the surface, but the narcosis slowed his movements and dulled his thoughts. His death marked the second drowning at 40 Fathom Grotto in less than 10 years. Working together, they recovered Skaff's body, but he wasn't officially identified until Monday. Patterson was treated at Shands Hospital in Gainesville. He recovered from the bends, and he was released after treatment. 40 Fathom Grotto claimed one more life in 2008, but today, the cave is leased to the Commercial Diving Academy, who added a new mixed gas fill station and renovated the cabins to make the destination more comfortable and appealing to divers all across the world. They dream of restoring the cave to its status as a world-class training facility. Hopefully, these tragic deaths will be the last lives ever claimed by 40 Fathom Grotto. Can you imagine the terror of getting hit with multiple life-threatening situations all at once? Are you brave enough to explore the abyssal reaches of deep cave diving? Tell us your thoughts and experiences in the comments section below. While you're there, make sure to hit the like button if you respect the sacrifices pioneers like Vincent Skaff made to the history of scuba, and also make sure to subscribe to the channel for more grim tales from deep below.